these two new ones, and let me go through these two. So collapse and expansion. So this is very much on my mind with, and probably everyone's mind with the current presidential election, and so okay. So let's go through the expansion part first, right? If you click every link here, I guarantee you will learn something that you haven't, you probably weren't aware of before, right? So most of the time when people, why is this stuff relevant to us, right? We live through an era where, especially if you're in the West, it's sort of portrayed as sort of stasis. Countries can't change, borders can't change, the establishment continues forever, and so on and so forth. And it reminds me a lot of this book from the Soviet era called Everything Was Forever Till It Was No More. This is this amazing book from the Soviet Union where everything was sort of in stasis, the post-war era, the Soviet system was in stasis until it just collapsed, right? And that's kind of like this thing that I've shown you before, which is sort of the mark-to-market on Biden, where it was stasis and then just mark-to-market overnight, right? So this is everything was forever until it was no more as sort of a price graph almost, right? And a lot of things are like this where they're in stasis and then there's sudden change. It's the Lenin saying. Lenin has the saying like there's weeks where there's decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen, and that's what this looks like, right? Okay. So let's talk about the expansion phase and then the contraction phase, right? So, there's a lot of stuff, again, that you probably got to just kind of uninstall or partially uninstall. Some of the stuff you've learned in college or just imbibe, which is, Group A beat up Group B, and that's extremely unusual and bad, and everybody was a noble savage before that ever happened. Actually, all humans have been beating up all humans forever, okay? And as you go and click through this, you'll learn about various kinds of empires and colonizations and expansions that you may have never heard of before, like the Bantu expansion, for example, right? So essentially, as you go through genetics in particular, genetics gives a new map of human history that complements the map of archaeology and pottery and so on and so forth and linguistics. So this is just a map of just like the kinds of expansions back and forth that have happened, but let me go through some of these, right? So, there's, if you look at the Silk Road, you'll learn about the fact that Eastern empires actually existed. There's, the motivation for Columbus actually going and expanding to the Americas was actually the Turks had blocked the path to India, so they needed a new path, right? So that was actually something where the Ottoman Empire was actually powerful enough at that time. It wasn't that the Europeans were always the most powerful, they were actually weak enough they could just plow through and they had to go around, okay? The Phoenicians actually, one of the things that's kind of amazing, as you'll kind of learn about in this, is that history is sort of like a game of civilization where there's some civilizations that rose and they collapsed and you've just never heard of them again, but they were a big deal at that time, right? So, the Phoenicians were these guys that built this entire civilization in the Mediterranean, and then they're gone, right? Did you know, for example, that the Incas had a giant road network, and that some of those roads are still actually travelable today, right? And the grandest engineering achievement of the pre-Hispanic America is 3,700 miles along the Andes. It's kind of interesting, this is just stuff which I'm just kind of touching on about like 15 different civilizations here, but as you kind of go through this, if you touch all of them, you're like, oh, okay, I didn't even know that existed. It's just not part of the narrative that you've heard for whatever reason, right? The British East India Company was actually predated by the Dutch East India Company. I think, while these get a lot of flack because they did do a lot of bad things later on, they were also innovative in the sense of some of the first multinationals that actually really pioneered a lot of stuff we know today about joint stock corporations and so on and so forth. Now here's something that many people have never heard of, which is the so-called Bantu expansion, okay? So basically, Africa isn't a static kind of thing. If you watch this video on the Bantu expansion, this is like maybe arguably the most important event in Africa over the last 2,000 years, where a West African group of people just basically radiated down all along the continent. And you can see that there's, just like there's different kinds of European people, different kinds of people in Asia, there's different kinds of people in Africa. And the Bantu expansion is this massive, massive event that most people don't even know happened, right? The most dramatic demographic event in late Holocene Africa fundamentally reshaped the linguistic, cultural, and biological landscape of the continent, right? The reason this is important is there's a story that says only Europeans were colonializers or what have you, but actually Africans were, Asians were, Middle Easterners were, people were at one point or the other point of the spear at different points in history, right? Once you kind of have that sort of maturity, it's just a different, you just have a different vantage point on history, right? So this is something where the data from 1,763 participants, you can actually show the expansion and what we now call the conquering, and you could use other words, what the Mongols did, right? And you can just see that it's not something where people were peaceful forever, okay? People, everybody was kind of conquering and killing everybody for a long time. The Polynesians in the South Pacific, how did they expand, right? So how did they expand across the Polynesian Triangle? One of the common themes here is you'll see that actually, the Polynesians, the Incas, they actually were technological pioneers. It's roads, it's, the sailing that they were able to, like if you look at the thousands of miles across where they were able to get, this was not something that it wasn't a trivial thing for them to do. They, in some alternate reality, maybe they could have gone all the way to South America, but they didn't make it all the way there. They did make it across thousands of miles. And as you kind of go through this, another example that people don't know about usually is that Russians had their own version of manifest destiny. Okay, so people know that the Cold War in the 20th century was between the U.S. and the USSR, and they sort of know that both of them had a big population, both America and Russia, and they know that America expanded in the 1800s, but they don't know that the reason that Russia is as big as it is because it doesn't have secure borders, so it just expanded until it got quasi-secure borders. Like, as the stereotype goes, for the American it's about freedom, and for the Russian it's about security. And so they just expand until they have roughly defensible borders. And so the Russian discovery of Siberia and how they actually expanded into it is just a whole story that's just told much, much less than the Wild West story. It's like the Wild East story. The expansion of Islam, okay? This is one of the most successful, in a sense, expansions in history. It's controversial, but you can read about how did Islam go from just the Middle East all the way out to the Atlantic and the Pacific in a few hundred years, just from a abstract 50,000 feet aliens looking down, very, very successful military / ideological kind of expansion, very big deal. Got all the way out to like Algeria today and all the way out down to Indonesia. And that happened very, very fast, right? So the spread of Islam. And, this one is wrong, I'll have a different link there, but the International Space Station there, I'll fix a link there. So the point of this is just, if you knew about every single one of those civilizations, I'd be impressed, right? Many people don't know about the Bantu, they don't know about the Siberian expansion, or they don't know how quickly Islam expanded, and so on and so forth. And once you kind of see that, you have a respect like, oh, the Incas did roads and the Polynesians did, sailing. There's a respect for kind of the expansion, technological capabilities of many different civilizations over time, and also recognition that these historical peoples weren't victims, and that expansion doesn't always mean A is beating up B and B was weak all the time, right? There are times when Europeans were also victims, when the Mongols or the Arabs expanded into Europe, and then vice versa, right? So there's an ebb and flow with it, and we're actually at an ebb in some ways for Western Europe, and I think history is running in reverse, and so we'll have to, it's worth understanding that. So that's on the expansion. Now let's talk about the collapse. So one of my favorite podcasts is something called the Collapse of, or Fall of Civilizations podcast, right? And this guy just made a book on this. It's really worth getting. I like this a lot, okay? By this guy, Paul Cooper. And the thing that I get from reading this and from watching these podcasts is, if you ever played a video game, like Battletoads or something like that, you get to like level 80 and then you die. Then you have to reboot all the way from the beginning, right? That is a lot of what human history is like. Okay, you have these incredible ancient civilizations that got much further than you'd expect, and they just go to zero with some internal collapse. And in a sense, we're the human civilization that has gone longest, and gotten furthest, gone all the way out to space, to our knowledge, the only one that's been able to do so. But it could go to zero if you think about the past ones, and this is something I think about a fair bit, right? Like, it's not assured that you just have progress. The best way I can show that is this graphic, okay? This is, it seems like human civilization is rising, going all the way into the Romans, and then you've got the Dark Ages, right? That's like a multi-hundred-year collapse over here, where you're going down 99%, and then it takes a while, almost 1,000 years, before the reboot gradually starts. Okay, so civilizations can collapse. You can literally have 1,000 years of darkness, relative darkness, before you have the Renaissance and the reboot. Okay, 1,000 years is a long time, right? So the reason I say that is, again, this is something which, the modern mind, there's a lot of people who just are completely dismissive about this as a possibility. They're dismissive about both expansion and collapse. They think that current society will remain forever, that especially Western civilization will remain on top forever, that has infinite money, infinite military, and so on and so forth. And they're saying something of the time dynamics of these ancient, once proud civilizations and their rise and fall, I think, falsifies that, right? At least you start thinking of things as much more dynamic. You start thinking of it more like a company where if you're not constantly growing, you're dying. And if you're not, if you're taking defeat after defeat at a certain point, maybe it doesn't work out for you. So going through the kind of collapse examples, right? This is one of my favorite things in history, this crazy thing called Göbekli Tepe, okay? And what it did is it reset our clock of like when humans were civilized, right? They dug this thing out of the ground. It's like so much older than we thought of as human civilization being, and you start thinking, wait a second, maybe we just made it and collapsed and rebooted and collapsed. This is like, more than 10,000 years before Christ, right? And I mean, 1,000 years is a long time, so like 10,000 years is, that one of the things that's really interesting is ancient Egypt had their own word for archaeologists, because the ancient Egyptians were as ancient to the ancient Egyptians as the ancient Egyptians are to us, okay? They were double ancient in a sense, right? So they were like, what were these crazy guys thinking? Just like we're thinking the same thing about them, right? So this concept of, isn't that funny, right? Yeah. So civilizations have collapsed, and we've been digging through the rubble and trying to figure out what the heck happened to them. And that's happened like over and over again. And the question is, can we like break out of that cycle and make it to the stars? Or will we all just collapse and kill each other again, this time nuclear weapons or whatever? This is the kind of thing I think about a lot. This thing that actually Elon thinks about a lot. That's why he wants to back up civilization or what have you, right? And this is also what Thiel thinks about, the deadly race between technology and politics. Like, can we escape? Can we expand? Can we exit? Or will we all fight amongst each other endlessly, right? So Göbekli Tepe is this insane thing where, again, just like knowing about this stuff, I find this is like the kind of thing that's mind expanding for me, where I'm like, wow, civilization went back way farther than I thought. Humans are much more resourceful than I thought. They could do so much more with so much less, but they also are much more combative than I thought, where they could kill each other and zero it out over and over again, right? Here's another one. This is a mystery of history called the Sea People. Basically, responsible for destruction of old powers such as the Hittite Empire. Nobody knows exactly who the Sea People were. Were they like the ancient, it's kind of this mystery as to like what modern civilization, if one exists, is the descendant of the Sea People. But these are these like marauding, tribes where you read the history books and they're like, oh, the Sea People came, and it's the last thing they write down, right? So, you can read about them. I find that fascinating. This is an obvious one, 476, Roman Empire, if you don't know about that. The end of the Spanish Empire, right? And, I had this tweet, let me see if I can find this. All did fall, right? Fall of the Soviet Union, right? Sunrise to sunset of the British Empire, right? Rise and fall of the Spanish Empire, and decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And the thing is, like, no one's talking about the Spanish Empire, or the Portuguese Empire, or the Dutch Empire, but they actually predated the British Empire, and the British Empire learned lessons from their rise and fall, and was somewhat longer in its longevity, in part because of that. But it's worth understanding. What was? Oh well, did they have a giant oceanic conflict with a peer power, oh, that might be a bad thing to do, you know, like China, Taiwan versus the US, or there might be, this is just like an interesting kind of lesson. The Spanish Armada just got blown to pieces, and that was this climactic kind of thing that, that led to the fall of the Spanish Empire, right? You know, one thing also people don't really think about in history is the British Empire sort of, you know, was defeated in America and sort of pivoted to India, right? So put more resources into India after it lost in America. There's the Peloponnesian War, that's what ended, you know, Greece's golden age. So some of these civilizations die in a sense by suicide, some by invasion, right? This, you know, just understanding how long and dark the Dark Ages were and how low it went is important, just because, again, people don't get that it can go to zero. Here's one, again, you probably don't know about, the Umayyads and the Abbasids. How'd they fall, right? These were actually these great Muslim dynasties, and what led them to break apart, right? What led the Mayans to collapse, right? There's Mayans and the Incas, again, what caused their collapse? These are mysteries of history that are actually, you just kind of get way more nutrition out of this, in my view, than another headline, you know, on the election. Not as much as I love the election or whatever, it's like watching sports, you know. Actually, politics is, you know, somebody once told me, politics is sports for smart people, but I'm not actually even sure if it's for smart people. So then, like, what ended the Mongol Empire, right? So this is also something where these guys just radiated out, they acquired this gigantic amount of land, and then they did collapse. Why, right? And I feel like, you know, if you just kind of click these links and you know, the added signal you get here from first knowing that these things even existed, knowing that they rose, and knowing that they fell, and just having that vocabulary, like how many of your friends even know the Bantu expansion happened, right? How many of them know, you know, who the Sea people were, or what have you? Just, I feel like that is more valuable than the same narrative of 1776, 1865, 1945, which you've heard 5,000 times, right? And this is also stuff which could be amazing for AI videos, right? The Sea peoples are very mysterious. You know, where do they come from? What do we know about them? One other thing to keep in mind, by the way, whenever you're talking about ancient history, there is a sense, if you've heard, like, journalism is the first draft of history. Now, you guys know what I think and people think nowadays about journalists, but if they were neutral, right, one thing to understand is a lot of this stuff is like, it is like a mystery, where you have to piece it together with lots of contradictory stories to figure out what actually happened. And a lot of what we know about history, you know, there's an Onion article that I wish I could find from like the late 90s, and maybe somebody here can find it, where it's like people from the year 4000, and they're digging up the year 1998, and they find, for example, all these Britney Spears CDs, and they hold it up and say, you know, Miss Spears must have been a queen because, you know, they made many shrines to her, you know, around, right? And you start to get a sense of how, like, you know, we are starting to think about the past and how it's sort of a distorted version of it based on, like, you know, how we're perceiving it, right? So so the V1 just understand what the history books say, and then the V2, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, there's a really, really amazing book by David Reich, Who We Are and How We Got Here. Really phenomenal book. Reich is a real pioneer, and the science of the human past, where with genetics we can go and we can confirm certain theories and we can explode other theories, right? Very high signal book by a very smart guy on human evolution, and this is now 6 years old, but it's still, you know, pretty important. So, okay, so that is the collapse and the expansion tutorials, and I think you'll get a fair amount of signal out of that. That's just the kind of stuff that I think a lot about. Now, let's see, let me go through Q&A. Oh, I'll say one other thing, right? So I've talked to several of you guys about what we're doing next before we go through Q&A, but I'll just kind of put it on screen. So right now, here we are, we're at Network School, co-working over there, right? We are seriously contemplating getting a huge swath of land above here, as well as lots of apartments. Here's what it looks like from a drone shot, right? So this is Network School, the co-working here. If we go through it, we'll get a big chunk of this land over here, and we'll build the Network School campus, right? So we'll have like a bridge, and we'll have a giant conference center, we'll have co-working, we'll have cafe, we'll have AI department, crypto, bio, etc. And our MVP V1 of V1 that you have here will get radically leveled up over the next few months or thereabouts, right? You guys are like, you know, in the Wild West where you just kind of set down the lean-to and so on. You're like the first 100, and then we might scale up dramatically to like 1,000 X number of people. And we're looking right now at a bunch of stuff, especially all these kinds of crazy, sophisticated tents that you can do. And when I say tent, I really mean temporary structure, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of really awesome looking stuff that you can get going, right? And so we're picking, we don't necessarily want it to look like a carnival all the time, you know? But there's really amazing stuff that you can do nowadays in terms of sort of temporary or modular prefab kind of housing and spacing, right? And you know, here's like pop-up stores that look like containers, you know, lots and lots of stuff that you can do on bare land that can get snapped together very quickly, right? And you can make networks of them, hubs of them, all this kind of stuff, right? So, so we are looking at this. We're just trying to figure out what balance of futuristic versus fast versus this versus that we want. But this is what, you know, we are working on now, and we'll just kind of figure out, you know, what we end up with. But we've got enough space to work with here potentially, right? So that's what's coming next, and what I'd like this to be is something where NS members live in the apartments that we retrofit over here, and then NS members and visitors come across the bridge every day over here, and we have a conference center. So if you're doing, we want to try to, knock on wood, hold Network State 2025 there, hold Solana events there, Ethereum events, Bitcoin events, Don't Die, Coinbase events. All of Asia, by the way, so, you know, my friends at Electric Capital just came up with a study which says that, here we are, let's see if I can find the visual. Yeah, so it's fortunately and unfortunately, both at the same time, the flippening is here, okay? Crypto is now primarily in Asia. It's gone up almost 30 points in 10 years, right? And thanks to all the regulatory attacks in North America in particular, that's dropped from 45% to like 27%. Okay, so I think that we'll see whether that continues or flattens out. Like Europe, bounce back a little bit. Go ahead. Sure. This is from the Electric Capital Global Crypto Developer Data Report. Right? Sorry, was there a question? Right, go ahead. So my view is, rather than having, I mean, we hold these crypto conferences all over the world. We hold them in like Colombia or something like that. Let's say there's 1,000 people who come there or what have you. People are spending millions of dollars on the plane flights. They go to Colombia or whatever, and then they all vanish, a few days afterwards, right? Instead, I think an alternative paradigm that could be really much better is we build a giant conference center here, right? We also build, I don't know if you guys have seen Token 2049, like all the booths, right? They have these insane, like they build these mini cities here, which have all of these crazy booths, right? And maybe somebody has a good video of this, but like this, but times like 100, right? And some of them are very elaborate, where they're not just shops, but they've got like mechanical stuff and like LED screens and so forth. And they all dismantle that after like a few days, okay? So what I want to do is have a giant conference center and also a 50 or 100 programmable booths next to it, okay? So that if you're holding a conference, we can just, like this, just configure all those booths to have your pop-up city there of biotech vendors or Solana vendors or what have you, and then just dismantle or just, put different things on screen afterwards, but not fully dismantle it, right? And the reason that'll be cool is NS members and NS visitors will every conference we hold will get more NS members and NS visitors, right? And so now you're actually compounding rather than just spending all the money in Colombia or whatever for no reason. So I'd like to, over time, turn this into the #1 place that people are holding, starting with Asia crypto, because you have to start somewhere, right? And then we will probably expand either horizontally or vertically, like global crypto, right? So, or Asia tech, right? One of those two. So you go Asia crypto, then Asia robo and bio and so on and so forth, and then it becomes more of a global center, or conversely the other way, we become global crypto. And I think it'll probably be Asia X, Asia Y, Asia Z, just given the location or what have you, right? So that's it for today. Let me go through some quick questions. So that's basically tutorials, bounties, other stuff. We'll have more content coming soon. Let me go through some quick questions. So cultural versus ethnic expansion. Good question. So one way I kind of think about this is, so software versus hardware. Okay, let me give you an example. So if you think about it, you look at a flag on a Chinese warship on the South China Sea, okay? They will have, let's see, hammer and sickle flag. Okay, they will have this, communist flag, right, on a warship in the South China Sea, okay? Now, if you think about what that is, right, versus how communism arose, right? Like, literally, communism arose, like here, okay, by Europeans for like a workers' revolution that was like anti-nationalist and, so on and so forth. And then where's the number one communist state? It's like here, okay, on the other side of the world. And the hammer and sickle is being turned into effectively a nationalist symbol as opposed to an international symbol. And it's essentially, that China's like the world's, arguably the furthest right state, ultra-nationalist as opposed to ultra-communist, right? Or at least it's certainly not leftist in any traditional definition. You can argue that point, but I can argue your argument. So the reason that that's interesting is the software, the ideological wave, moved independently of the hardware, which is to say, like, that idea arose in a sense on European hardware, and then it moved all the way across, right? Now, actually, if you know anything about genetics, this actually happens with genes a lot, right? You'll have, and one of the most non-obvious things is when you start looking at genetics rigorously, you will see that there's some genes, some alleles, like lactose tolerance, that are so advantageous that when they arise, they just expand out very rapidly, and they move much faster than the founding population. They kind of move independently of the overall genetic makeup that makes that person, right? So there's some ideas that they arise in a certain area and then just go woof like this, and they radiate out very fast, right? And so I think that on this concept, I think what comes after Western values are internet values, right? Even the concept of the West itself, there used to be the concept, Europe self-conceptualized itself as Christendom, right? And Christendom was sort of the borders of both the hardware and the software, like hardware European, software Christendom. And it was kind of fuzzy, but many sets are fuzzy. And then the concept of the West was a geographical, technological, and ideological change. Geographical to encompass the US, technological because now you have steamships and so on. And then ideological, the West is a more secular conception as opposed to Christendom, right? And I think the next step is the internet, where it expands further. It's clearly, it's kind of west of the West. You go all the way west to California and you go to the cloud, right? Or you go all the way over to Asia or something like that. So far west, you end up in the Far East, right? And I think that if you look at the proportion, for example, of, what is the internet? It's like roughly it's like a third, European and a third Chinese and a third South Asian, or something like that, a third global, right? In terms of hardware, software, et cetera, contributions, right? So that is kind of my view on what comes next is, like Western values, even within the West, aren't really supported anymore, but internet values are, right? So that's my answer on that. What factors contribute to China's enduring continuity over thousands of years? Oh man, who's much better on this? I'm not there's people who are really amazing Chinese historians, but one of the really, what's it called? It's like this is a book that was recommended to me by somebody who knows a lot about Chinese history, and I like it a lot. It's this random seeming thing. It's called Quick Access to Chinese History. Terrible name, okay? It just sounds terrible, but it's awesome because it literally takes you, it's almost like a graphical thing that, let me see if I can find the, the thing about this. It's literally a timeline like this. This is why this book is super cool. It's a timeline like this. I think actually all history books should be like this. Okay, where like high signal, one book on Chinese history, I've learned the most from this, and this is, sometimes you ask an expert, okay, give me one book, and then that gives you that's the ripest fruit. You get a big bite out of that, right? So, quick access to Chinese history. I think somebody should do this for Indian history. Somebody should do this for other kinds of things. Title it somewhat different, like the timeline or something like that, right? But this is like you just learn a ton from something like this, right? Just flip all the way from the beginning to the end. So the answer to your question is, I don't know, Camellia, why China rebooted multiple times. This guy, he lives in Singapore. He's a fund manager. Jim Rogers. Yeah. China's fallen and risen multiple times. I think he's talked about this. Is he the one who's talked about this? Basically, I think it's either Jim Rogers or somebody else talked about how China's one of the very few civilizations, if any, that has just collapsed and just rebooted multiple times. Part of it is managed to keep, to some extent, its territorial integrity with this. It was sort of the same people, and so they didn't get conquered by abroad or what have you. Or the conquerors became essentially the Chinese, that's the way the dynasty works. So that's my answer, Camellia. I don't know the answer, but I think quick access to Chinese history might give a better answer. Jackson, I imagine many folks in the U.S. won't believe the reported election results this week. Is credible? Could the U.S. restore faith in its election system? How? A really good question. I actually had this kind of, I think it's a funny tweet, which was no ID, no democracy. And because there's a Sybil attack, this is obvious, 5 million people have said this, but I actually hadn't seen somebody analogize it to something we know exists in cryptography and computer science, right? It's literally a Sybil attack. If anybody can vote multiple times. Now, of course, there's privacy protecting ways of dealing with ID. If privacy was actually a consideration, you could use ZKID or a bunch of things that exist now, right? But you do want to ensure uniqueness. Anyway, so Estonia has solved this, tiny countries have solved this with hardware wallets. India actually, to my surprise, and the thing is, just as a small digression or whatever, I was never, I'm 44, okay? The first 20 years of my life, being Indian as a kid in the US was not an asset, I just had a funny name, okay? It was just something which was basically a negative up until about the year 2000. Then, when I was in tech for about 15 years or something, nobody cared. It was just, basically working in tech. Nobody even said anything about it. But then, over the last 5 or 6 years, especially since Reliance Jio took off in India in the late 2010s, India has just started really executing and doing phenomenally well. So I was never an India booster just for the sake of being an India booster, but I'm a realist, and just seeing how well India has done is really remarkable. And, as I said, you can learn a lot from comparative civilizations going across in space and time. And you can see how, frankly, in my view, I think it is fair to say now, even though it's not going to be well accepted for a long time, India is the world's leading democracy. Okay, why do I say that? Because it's the world's leading functional democracy. It's at a billion-person scale. It conducted a gigantic election. It's actually very high-tech how they did it, both high-tech and low-tech, right? They have Aadhaar, which is like a global ID system, right? They had, low-tech stuff like with the fingerprinting, 46,000 polling stations. They just executed phenomenally well on this. And the election went and nobody contested the results. And that's like the dark horse, right? I think what is likely to happen, in my view, is something very similar to what happened after 1991. Like, the Soviets had an ideological form of communism, and they were the world's leading brand of communism. And then they just crashed after 1991, and then all of Eastern Europe, everybody rejected communism, and they had a political change. And then what happened was the Chinese just kept continuing with communism. They just did capitalism and called it communism, right? It was just like an Asian pragmatic version, communism with Chinese characteristics. And that gradually has now become the world's leading brand of communism. And I think something similar is going to happen with democracy, right? The Western version of democracy is going to be discredited due to the level of fighting that's happening in Western Europe and America over the next number of years. And that's going to tarnish the democracy brand over there, and whatever people think that they're for will not be democracy. But actually, the Indian version of democracy is functional, and it's coinciding with a technologically rising civilization. So just like the Asian version of communism gradually became the world's leading communism, the Asian version of democracy will become the world's leading democracy, which is a sort of dark horse prediction. But again, if you look at the tech stack over here, I'm not an India booster for the sake of it, but there's a lot that you can learn from how to accomplish this in a very, money-constrained, tech-constrained environment. Like, they had the spirit to do it, right? So anyway, I tweeted this out. It's worth reading about. Like, again, with 150th the GDP per capita, it's doing fairly well. And then the high-tech version is the Estonia version, which is how did Estonia carry out the world's first mostly online national election. So the point is, like a tiny European country and the largest country in the world, like 1000x, both managed to do a way better job than what the US is doing, right? So the good thing about that is, like, these are sort of on the edges of empire, right? Like India and Estonia sort of rebooted post-1991. Estonia got its independence then, India got capitalist then. And so that thing that Bjorn said about like how the software, paraphrasing, but the culture has kind of gone out, and the folks on the borders have actually done a better job with that culture than the folks in the center, right? This is something that Ibn Khaldun calls the marcher lords, right? So basically, let me see if I can find this. This is a deep cut. So the marcher lords, essentially, Ibn Khaldun, if you read his work, right? This is getting into not 101 but 201 level collapse and rise of civilizations. His theory is that the guys who take over after civilization falls are actually not true barbarians, nor are they usually from the capital, but they are what he calls the marcher lords, who are the people who are on the border between civilization and the wilderness, and they have kind of one foot in both worlds, right? So they're not true barbarians. They can speak, they can read, they can write, they know technology, and so on. But they're also not totally effete from the capital because they are actually working and interacting with nature, and they're building up nature from scratch, right? Today, I would consider that to be the tech CEOs, right? Like what Elon is doing with space is he's fighting nature with one hand, but clearly he's also from civilization on the other hand. However, he's not in DC where everything is working and taken for granted or what have you, right? So the marcher lords are often the ones who take over after the center collapses. And in a sense, if you think of Estonia and India's position in the international system, they're on the edges of the West in both a literal and physical sense, but they have actually a more advanced system in a technological sense, and they've got more internal civilization self-confidence. So that kind of what succeeds the center. It's not pure barbarian, nor is it someone adjacent within the capital. It's a marcher lords, right? And Ibn Khaldun, again, over thousands of years of history, he talks about this. Okay. Let's see. So can the U.S.? No, I don't think the U.S. can. That's my short answer, because I don't think it's the United States. I think it's the disunited states. So this is basically the visual. I've shown this a bunch of times, but there's a bunch that are like this. It's not one country, it's two parties. And this is something, what this graphic represents is each node's a congressman, colored blue or red by their party. Edge between them is if they voted the same way on the same bill. So in the 1950s, they vote yes together or no together all the time, and by 2011, they didn't. And you can see that that now extends to the population at large. By 2017, totally different data set. Each node here is a Twitter user, and they're colored blue or red by their expressed public sympathy for, in this case, Clinton or Trump. And the edge between them is if they follow each other. And so you can already see this coming apart, not just at the leadership level, but at the population level. That was 7 years ago. Now today you have Gab, you have Truth, you have X. Reds are in their own world, and then blues are in Blue Sky and Mastodon and Threads in their own world. So the digital secession is already here, right? And one of my views is that after 2020, we're in an internet-first world, where everything happens on the internet first, then it gets printed out in the physical world. Example, you go to Amazon, you scroll through, you fill up your cart, and when you care, you hit enter, and it gets printed out in the physical world, right? You go to Grab, you scroll through, okay, boom, you hit enter and the car arrives, gets printed out in the physical world, right? You type a document, and if it's really important, you hit enter, it gets printed out in the physical world. Everything happens internet first. You meet somebody on the internet, and if they really want to hang out with them, boom, signal, write message, meet up in person, print it out in the physical world, right? So everything happens internet first, and then it gets printed out. And that means that this fight here that we can see in digital space is quite important, and it will get printed out into the physical world in some form of separation and chaos and what have you to happen, right? That to me is the most predictable thing ever. And if you look at, you know, how long this has been going on, this has basically been going on for almost 70 years, this kind of mitosis, this split. It's not like a recent thing. It's also not something you can completely blame on the internet because it predated even the internet. This polarization was happening even before the internet. The internet was just turbocharged, right? Okay. So let me go through a few more questions and let's wrap it to the end. Cutting edge developments in transhumanism. Okay, great question. Okay, so this is something I care about a lot, right? The only problem is people don't like the term transhumanism, so I actually have a better term. And the term is, ready? Here we are. So,
do you like being called an eccentric tech genius? Sorry, I just
do I? Is that the
last one? It was like on Wired or something.
Oh, I'm
it's
sure.
Like eccentric tech genius. Apologies, Watson.
I guess.
I'm
better than a lot of other names people would call me. Yes, sure.
I just love journalistic descriptors. They're always hilarious.
Yes, it is funny, right? So this is let me see, Twitter search. I do think needs to improve. Yeah, here we are. So let me actually talk about this for a second because this is something I do think is important. So this was a rebrand. I'm not like, and what I mean by that is the problem with transhumanism is like it's just a change. Is it good or bad? A lot of people will think, oh, you know, it's the island of mishappened toys. You're just going to make like, you know, Quasimodo or whatever, you know, running around. But human self-improvement. Basically, people are in favor of that. That's Tim Ferriss. That's, you know, like just discipline. That's working out, and so on and so forth. The prefix human, in a sense, is redundant, but it also connotes sort of a biological or health characteristic to that, right? And so everybody's in favor of human self-improvement because it's a continuum. It's like, okay, do I just eat salad? All right, then do I lift? Okay, great. Do I take creatine? All right, how about Ozempic? Sure. And you figure out where you are on that spectrum, where you stop, right? Wherever is comfortable for you, where your risk-adjusted threshold is, right? That's human self-improvement, right? And human self-improvement can be cognitive as well, right? Like really what the Network School is about human self-improvement and just building yourself up every week, win and help win, and then help your community, right? So a collective as well as an individual. So A is, I do think that this is an important trend. B is something that is a burgeoning thing among tech guys, for sure, is how do humans compete with artificial intelligence? Perhaps we just need to increase human intelligence, right? The technology is now there to do this, and this is a really interesting post by this guy on Less Wrong, like that you might actually be able to upgrade living humans, not just future humans with embryo selection. So this stuff is bubbling, and I think that you're going to see that Asian cultures, you know, for example, actually many people don't know this. There's a great book by Yale Hashiloni Delove on, let me show you two things that maybe you guys don't know. So this is a book from 20 years ago, and it found that essentially, oh, did they change the thing here? Let's see if I can find this. It's got a, you know, provocative title, but I think the basic thing is that, yeah, in Germany, social, cultural, religious, and legal conditions restrict the selection of embryos based on prenatal diagnosis. In Israel, they strongly encourage it, right? So because Israel has a history of Jewish genetic diseases and so on, and no one can call them, they say they're Nazis, or I guess some people will say that. But point though is that basically Israel they have a need for it because they've got, you know, Tay-Sachs and torsion dystonia and a bunch of those things, and they select, right? The other big thing is the Pew poll on genetic engineering. So another big group that is extremely pro genetic engineering is India, 64% of Indians are okay with making babies more intelligent, right? So if you have India and Israel both in favor of genetic enhancement, right? That's a critical mass of scientists, technologists, capital, know-how, and moxie to go and make it happen, right? So this is, I think, part of what's going to come over the years to come, in the sense that we have, we have space, we have robotics, we have a bunch of other stuff. We haven't yet gotten is biotech, right? And how do humans compete with artificial intelligence? Well, we have to be able to maybe increase human intelligence. Now, there's of course negative ways to talk about everything, blah, blah, right? And you can just imagine people will be like, oh my God, artificial intelligence was silicon eugenics, right? And like silicon, imagine you made computers smarter and you benchmark them. Of course, the difference is this is something where it'd be opt-in, it'd be consensual, it's reproductive choice, right? Completely different than coercion. Anyway, so this is an interesting area that is absolutely rising. Altman has funded it, Elon has funded it. Many people have put checks into this area. So this is definitely something that's coming. And it's going to be something that is going to come probably outside of Western Europe and the US, right? That's a big thing. The US can no longer control these kinds of events anymore. The FDA is in disrepute around the world. It's losing control. And if India, Israel, other countries want to do this, it's just going to unlock in a way that I think people haven't really realized yet. There are people who are really big on this actually. Saudis, consanguinity is a big issue in the Middle East, and so genetic testing is a huge thing for Saudi Arabia and for the Middle East, and they have gigantic billions of dollars in oil money to go after this, right? So Israelis, Saudis, Indians. Go ahead. What happened?
Cousin marriage.
Oh, consanguinity? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thank you for asking. Consanguinity means cousin marriage, and it basically means for religious reasons. Yes, exactly. I didn't want to, I didn't want to pathologize anything, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean like inbreeding. Inbreeding is pejorative, right? Consanguinity just means that over a large family tree, there's a greater degree of like distant cousins marrying and so on and so forth. It's not literally marrying your sister or what have you, okay? So consanguinity just means like a somewhat narrowing of the family tree, right? Point is, this is something which is more common in the Middle East. It means that genetic testing is necessary there, right? So there's a lot more funding for this that is unlocking, and a lot of the technology is getting there as well, right? So another thing to know about is polygenic risk scores, right? So these have gotten really, really good. For example, for height, let's see if we can show the theory versus actual. So TLDR is, we can now predict something as complicated as, here we are, ready? This is amazing stuff. Genetically predicted height, measured adult height, that's a really, 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 really good correlation. That's really, really good, right? That's basically, it's pretty phenomenal. Like, to give you a sense of what a bad correlation looks like, so let's see if it's spherical. Where is it good? Man, Google sucks now. Okay, yeah. All right, so this is like bad correlation, where there's nothing, and then this is something like this or this. That's like a tight, linear correlation. To get something like this, that means we really kind of cracked the code, right? If you want to actually know how it's done mathematically, it's something called lasso or ridge regression, just a constrained regression on a large data set. It's actually not rocket science. It's not that hard to do. It's just large data sets, and you can kind of nail it, which is not obvious a priori that with large data sets you'll get there. Anyway, so we can now do this technologically. That was not the case really even 10 years ago, right? So TLDR is stay tuned on this, right? So cutting edge adult transhumanism. So look at polygenic risk scores, look at embryo selection, look at adult improvements, and of course also the stuff that Elon is doing with Neuralink is quite important. One thing, by the way, is it's funny because, for example, we talk about genetics and height, right? Oops. There we go. We talking about genetics and height, this is something that people are like, oh my God, would I increase my kid's height or whatever? But you know what they do is they give HGH, right? HGH dosage, human growth hormone. People will even do this probably have some gruesome pictures, but limb lengthening surgeries, right? So people will do the surgical treatments to increase height. They'll do the biochemical treatments to increase height, but they'll have a hang up about the genetic, right? And that doesn't make any sense. In fact, you can make a table for almost every single thing every single biological thing, and the surgical is allowed, and the biochemical is allowed, but the genetic is oh my God, right? And imagine if the pharmacy was called Euchemics. What, you want good biochemistry? Oh my God, you're a euchemicist, right? And why don't you want bad biochemistry, right? Anyway, I think a lot of that post-war vocabulary is going to get retired over the next few years, and we'll figure out a different path forward. Okay, I'll do one more. So, where in India could I be most bullish on for another number school? Great question. So there is something that I do have my eye on, which is not in India, but it's right next door. It's Gellifu. So this is a place in Bhutan that, so basically the king of Bhutan is a huge Bitcoiner, right? And 750 mil in Bitcoin holdings, right? It's a good start. Basically, that's something like because they've got cheap power there, right? So they've just been doing hydroelectric, and so he's a friend of mine, and they've wanted to do something for a while. So they have built this thing, Gellifu Mindfulness City, right on the border with India over here. Okay, and so that could be a really cool place to set up a network school node. Go ahead.
Can you tell us the story of how you became friends with the king?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, the thing about it actually, I don't want to kiss and tell or whatever, right? But here's something that I didn't actually realize, which is the world is in a sense more fluid than you might think. Where if you're at the top of your profession in one area, for example, okay, this is definitely not the only metric, but having 1 million Twitter followers it's like having $1 billion. Actually, I think somebody calculated there's fewer people with 1 million Twitter followers than $1 billion at some point in history, right? So it's at least comparable to that. And a lot of these folks who are politicians or world leaders, they know what their Twitter following is, and they're happy to talk to somebody who's an influencer or who's got more of a following. And so there's a lot of heads of state, governors, stuff like that, who are just happy to take a photo with you as a tech guy, who's had some success or what have you. So you realize kind of almost in a sense, if you're successful enough in tech, this is not exactly right. I'm very, 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 very much going to overstate, or this is a rough approximation, right? But if you build $1 billion company, you're almost like a global senator. Does that make any sense, right? So all kinds of leaders around the world want to meet with you. And by the way, that's what the Senate was supposed to be. Most people don't know this. The entire concept was in ancient Rome, they'd observed that society oscillated between, there was actually a tweet thread on this a little while ago, but people had also observed that society oscillated between monarchy and oligarchy and democracy, right? So the founders of the US said, what if we have a system that combines aspects of all three so they're in balance, right? We have the presidency, which is the monarchy, we have the Senate, which is the aristocracy, and we have the popular vote, which is the House of Representatives. And so these three things can be in balance, and so we can break the cycle and the whole thing won't collapse, so that, right? And the whole point was that the Senate was supposed to be men of accomplishment, right? Or men of, accomplished birth, or some combination thereof. But it's kind of like the House of Lords in Britain. Now that's kind of sort of passed off, but now the equivalent actually, China had something for a while where they basically gave the equivalent of Senate seats to Jack Ma and Pony Ma and so on and so forth. They gave them senior positions in the Communist Party, and they had some input into things, at the country level. And they just totally reversed that over the last 5 years, which is I think one of the stupidest decisions they've made, in my view. So anyway, the point is, the Senate used to be something where, like, the intent was for captains of industry, people like that, to be knighted and level them up, or the equivalent, into the Senate. That's like what the House of Lords, at least, was supposed to be like that, right? So the global Senate is kind of like the founders who are being successful, because all these countries, what do they want? They're often poorer. They're ambitious, though. They want to level up. They want to bring capital. They want to bring talent to their places, right? So a network school node, like, if, really all you guys need to do is just have good vibes, good spirit, and we build this from 100 to 1,000 people, and we build the tents, and we have the conferences here, and we have great content and great films. And then from that, every country will want one, right? And so we can just boot up these network school nodes around the world, and we can actually build something really, really pretty awesome, because they'll bring capital and talent to their regions. And in this fashion, we have competition for Silicon Valley, competition for San Francisco, that is absolutely doing the opposite. It's like this kind of stuff. You guys have seen this. Waymo car, mob attacks driverless car, sets it on fire, and so on and so forth, right? They smash it to pieces, or like die techie scum SF, right? These are all in my neighborhood, when I was there. I take this stuff very seriously, right? Because if we want to, the thing about it is, if go ahead.
Sorry, it's like die guppy scum. I saw that around Newtown in Sydney.
That's right. And the thing about this is, on the one hand, of course, it's like you also have to laugh at it in a sense, right? On the other hand, it's something where most of these people who put this stuff up there, they're not laughing. They actually hate you because they blame you for driving up prices and driving up the artists and what have you, right? And there's some truth to that, but there's also a lot of falsity to that, where the prices wouldn't go up if the supply of the housing wasn't being restricted. And in a sense, they're like, quote, anti-immigrant. They want all the immigrants to get out, go back where they came from, whatever, right? In that sense, right? So it's funny how this stuff overlaps. Anyway, point is, die techie scum, no one wants you here, die techie scum, defend the Bay Area, blah, blah, blah. So, go ahead. Go ahead.
Why did they choose the hipster over the die guppy scum?
Why did the hipsters pick this?
No, just the photo right there. It's kind of ironic. It's like a hippie dude.
Yeah. Anyway, so I don't know. There's just a bunch of them that are like this. Point is, the network school is the opposite of this, right? These people are really mad that technologists are coming in, and they don't want them there, and they're fighting it like organ rejection the whole time. If we have a catchment for the rain on the other side of the world, it'll just be like this. Electricity will just go between them like that. We'll catch all that rain, So it'll be pretty awesome. All right, thanks guys. That's it.